We are celebrating the Feast of the Presentation of the Lord yesterday, which technically in the really old calendar, way back, into the Middle Ages and so on, was the end of the Christmas season. Christmas lasted for 40 days. Sound familiar? We have 40 days of Christmas, and then we have 40 days of Lent, and we have 40 days of Easter, because then we get into what used to be called Ascension Tide. We simplified the calendar a bit. But what would happen now is actually that the way the calendar would work is that we would be beginning the pre-Lenten season. And that, I think I've mentioned this before, they had some really odd names. If you really go into the old prayer book, you would see things like Septuagesima Sunday, Sexagesima Sunday, and Quinquagesima Sunday. All those are simple, those words simply are Roman words for their numerals. So quinqua or septua is 70 and 60. So basically what happens is you count down that the season of Lent if you looked at Latin liturgical books today even is called Quadragesima. And that hails from the days, even though we now celebrate 5 proper Sundays in Lent and then Holy Week, it hails from the days where Passiontide, again, going to the old prayer book, you would see this. The first Sunday in Passiontide would be the Sunday that we celebrate as the 5th Sunday in Lent. So there would be 2 weeks of Passiontide, of which Holy Week was the 2nd week. And so actually the liturgical colors would change this coming Sunday. We'd go away from green and then come into purple, even though it's not Lent yet. And even if you go into the Orthodox tradition, already their seasons, of course, the calendar is a little bit different there, depends on when their Pascha falls, which is not always the same day as our Easter. Long story about that, but they begin, and they have different names for them. For example, it's Milk Fair Sunday and Cheese Fair Sunday and Meat Fair Sunday. And basically what those are the beginning of a week where they fasting from whatever it is, milk, cheese, meat, for the rest of the Lenten season. So they would be preparing themselves during this period, now even beginning, by beginning to eliminate elements from their diet to begin this season of fasting and repentance. It also is a season not only of fasting, but of abstinence, so that what happens is you begin to eliminate whole categories of food from your diet until you get to Holy Week. And in the Eastern tradition, basically by the time you get there, you're eating nothing but black bread and coffee. So, basically that's it, so it is a real idea of communal penance, that we are doing penance for our own sins, for the sins of the church and the sins of the world through this period of time. That's the Eastern thought. The Western church did something similar with this, so what we call the Jesimas, the 3 Sundays before Lent starts. But then on Ash Wednesday, it begins in earnest. And traditionally, again, going back to the ancient practices of the Western church, that in fact, during Lent, every day was a fast day, except for Sunday. So that and the rules were thus: you ate 1 principal meal in the course of a day, and you could take nourishment 2 other times during the course of the day, but both of those snacks, if you will, were not to add up to a whole meal. Those were the canonical rules for fasting. And then on Fridays, and on, of course, Ash Wednesday and all of the Fridays of Lent, as all the Fridays of the year at the time, you did not eat flesh meat. so that basically you weren't supposed to eat any sort of red meat. And then toward the end of the season, you weren't supposed to eat any flesh at all. So that goes more toward the Eastern way of meat fair Sunday. So, you know, I remember when I was a Roman Catholic as a young person, I would hear this term. Sometimes it was a derogatory term used by some Protestant denominations, where they called Catholics mackerel snappers, because because the idea was that they didn't eat meat on Fridays, but and that's also the advent of the tradition we have in many parts of our sort of Eastern and Northern European climes, in New York State, Pennsylvania, so on, of fish fries on Fridays, because often it was easier to have just these massive dinners in a parish, say. It became a money raiser for many people. And there are some restaurants that in Buffalo, I mean, you going to for a fish fry at Worzel's, for example, was a feast. So it sort of was counterintuitive, counterproductive to the idea of Lenten fasting. But then you get this huge piece of deep fried cod, and then you'd get potato salad and macaroni salad and rye bread with butter and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it was a feast, really. So, I mean, it was more of a treat than it was a penance. But this is the season where it starts. So what we get is a shift in the Gospels away from this idea of the manifestation of Jesus and who Jesus is, describing who Jesus is, looking at the miracles, for example, at Cana, and the actual stories that we've been getting over the last few weeks, now turning our attention to the more mundane elements of the beginnings of Jesus' ministry. So we just went through the narrative of the synagogue speech that Jesus gave. And then, of course, then we had last week the sort of second half of that narrative, which was the rejection of Jesus by the people of Nazareth. And that's what begins this sort of downward slope toward moving toward Lent. This week, it's a little bit different. We, in Luke's gospel in particular, this isn't the more traditional lections, but we now have the call of the first disciples in this coming Sunday. So I'm going to do screen share and we'll just read the lesson together. There we go. So the lesson begins with the first chapter, or the first verse of the 5th chapter of Luke. Once, while Jesus was standing beside the lake of Gennesaret, and the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he saw 2 boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little way from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Now put out into deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered him, "Master, we have worked all night long, but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." And when they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. They came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also there were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people." And when they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him. So we have this beginning story. Again, this is a season of beginnings when we start recalling the mission and ministry of Jesus. And we have this notion of the call of the disciples. Interestingly, Jesus really, in Luke's narrative, does not call to them. He basically said, he asks them to do something, they do it, a miraculous thing occurs, and they are awed by this. And Jesus simply says to them, don't be afraid. And because of this awe that they have for this teacher, they decide to follow him, interestingly, almost on their own. That there's no come and follow me kind of thing. He simply says, don't be afraid. From now on, you'll be catching people. And in that, of course, we can intuit the call that we hear in the other gospel narratives. For example, in John's gospel, Jesus outright says, come, follow me. Or others will say, come, we have seen this Jesus. Come, I want to show you. That was Andrew and Simon. That's how they, got together. So we have these different ways of articulating the call of the disciples. In this case, notice who he's calling. It's Simon, Andrew, and James. No, not James. I just got a little bit of a brain snark here. James and John, that's it. James and John. Simon, of course, becomes Peter eventually. But this is Jesus' closest, these becomes Jesus' closest friends. This becomes his inner circle. Who was with him on Mount Tabor for the transfiguration? Peter, James, and John. When he took people into the house, for example, to heal Peter's mother-in-law, who did he take with him? Peter, obviously, James, and John. This becomes that sort of kitchen cabinet, as it were. These are the special ones, the ones who were closest to Jesus. And they were with him, as we get in Luke's narrative, from the get-go. So as Jesus begins his ministry and he begins to realize, perhaps on a human level, he begins to realize that he's going to need help in this endeavor that he's undertaking. Then he looks around and he says, okay, how can I do this? And he decides that these guys seem to be as good as anybody. So he decides to get in league with them. And it's interesting how this all happens. Now, a few interesting details here. Notice that Simon says, we've been at it all night. We've caught nothing. We stop to think, when do the fish really come to the surface? Usually
sundown.
So that fishermen, when they go out, they either go out late in the evening or early in the morning at first light, because that's when the fish are available. Sometimes it has to do with the temperature of the water. Sometimes it happens to do with what they feed on, depending on the nature of the fish. For example, insects come out at night. Everybody's not like us. We're not like these. There's even a whole classification of mammals that we call nocturnal mammals. They only do things at night. Possums, for example. Other elements, bats. We don't like them, but they're kind of spooky for us, thanks to Bram Stoker. But the idea is that they're nocturnal because that's when they are at least risk of predators, for one thing, and secondly, that's when their food source arrives. So that they're actually evolved into this reality. So fishermen in the ancient world would often fish what we would say in the middle of the night, very early in the morning before sunrise. And they would be out there and they'd be trawling constantly. And unless there was a stiff breeze, trawling meant you had to row the boats and all. And of course, you got dragging nets. This was hard work because the nets were literally a drag on the boat. So the boat wouldn't go very fast. It would not go as fast as if it would without the nets in the water. And so they come in and they've had a bad night. They just have not caught many fish at all. And so Simon looks at Jesus and says, who are you kind of think of this conversation, put yourself in the context. Simon says, well, who are you? You're this, rabbi, preacher, if anything, you're a carpenter. What do you know about fishing? We've been here all night long. We haven't caught anything. And then somehow there's this magnetism about Jesus. That's sort of the implication here with Luke as well, that there's this sort of spirit about Jesus. And we heard about it last in this narrative that we had the two parts of over the last couple of weeks, when Jesus says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has sent me to preach good news to the poor, et cetera, et cetera. And so much so that the people of Nazareth get mad at him and want to hurl him over the edge of the cliff. And he simply walks through them. Well, I don't know whether they heard about that or what, because they're not anywhere near Nazareth at this point. They're at Gennesaret, so, which is on the shore. Nazareth is inland. And so there it is. Simon is looking at him and saying, oh, all right, hey, we didn't catch anything last night. If this guy thinks he knows what he's doing, let's just give it another try. And lo and behold, they catch so many fish that they have to signal for help to come get them. And that there are so many that the boats are overflowing. They're almost ready to sink. Now that is quite a haul. You think about it, it's quite a haul of fish. Now, it could be that the story is just what it is as we read it on the surface. Or it might be that because of what Jesus says at the end of this passage, that Luke is prefiguring something. Luke is prefiguring something about Jesus' ministry. Stop to think that the haul is going to be so great that they need to call for help. And what does Jesus do? At the end of it, he makes these three his principal helpers. So now they had this huge haul of fish, would be a lot of money for them. They bring it ashore and leave it for everybody else, and they follow this guy. Well, that doesn't make much sense to us. But when we look at it from a little different perspective, from a different point of view, we might see that this is a prefigurement of how Jesus will collect the men and women that we eventually call the church. And that this is the beginning of this notion of the apostolic foundation of the church. That the church, when we say the creeds, for example, we believe in one holy, Catholic, and apostolic church. In other words, it is based fundamentally on the teaching of the apostles. That's what we say when we renew our baptismal promises. Not only do we recite the Apostles' Creed, but we also say, will you continue in the teaching of the apostles, in the prayers and the teaching of the apostles? And we say, I will, with the help of God. So that this whole notion of the foundation of the church upon these closest associates becomes critical for Luke. Why? Because further down the road, again, think of Luke in this 2-volume series that he has. He has Paul going out and going to the rest of the world. So what are these people supposed to be believing? But what the apostles teach them. So this apostolic foundation is one way of looking at this particular narrative, where Jesus begins not only to call disciples, but to call those disciples that will provide the foundation stones, if you will, the living foundation stones for the living stones of the church, as we hear it in 1 Peter. So that's really perhaps what the core meaning of this is, that Jesus has begun his mission and ministry in Luke's narrative. Luke is a good storyteller. He begins his ministry in Nazareth. He's rejected in Nazareth, and so he moves on. And now he's at Gennesaret, which is on the Sea of Galilee. And he's there and he sees these fishermen. And he says, okay, I'm going to need help with this. And so, so he calls Interestingly, a couple of other little tidbits here. For example, notice that the crowds are there, they're listening to Jesus. And so he does this thing that's very rabbinical. He sits down to teach them. That's also been in the church for a long time. When a bishop teaches formally, we hear more about it in Roman practice, Roman Catholicism, when the prince of the apostles, namely Peter, namely the Pope, issues a teaching ex cathedra, from the chair, the chair. And formally speaking, what that means is essentially when an authoritative teacher is sitting in their chair of authority within the assembly, they are teaching truth. And so what does Jesus do? He takes the boat out so that he's a little bit separate from the crowd, and he sits down to teach them. So again, this is a very ancient tradition. It goes back to the ancient rabbis, where whenever you see a lot of art about Jesus teaching, he's normally not standing, he's sitting. Because that's what the posture of a teacher was. In our Western experience, we think of it exactly the opposite. You know, we go to our classrooms, who's sitting? The pupils. Who's standing? The teacher. In fact, if a teacher sits down, he or she is thought to be lazy. You know, it's that kind of thing. But in the ancient world, philosophers, look at the artwork where you see Socrates or Aristotle teaching. They're not walking. They're not, well, Aristotle was considered peripatetic, but the more foundational is that they're sitting. Look at Michelangelo's statue of Moses, the giver of the law. Go into art again, you know, the Renaissance art. What is Moses doing? He's sitting. He's sitting in a big chair, this massive chair, and he's got the tablets of the law in one arm and his hand extended in another. You know, the classic pose of a classical teacher. And what was the Renaissance? It was a recovery of classical art in a lot of ways, in those art forms. And so they were reinstituting what was and remembering collectively an ancient practice, which was the principal teacher, the authoritative teacher, sat. And so there's that image that Luke gives us, that what does Jesus do? He goes and he sits down. He's on the shore, so there's no place to sit. So he takes a boat. And probably he could be heard a little bit better. The acoustics of speaking from the water without any obstruction, and the water is a hard surface, so it helps to bounce the sound around and so on. So it's maybe some practical things about that. But also, and principally symbolically, he sits. Again, this is one way of Luke saying, this is the guy with the authority. This is the capital T teacher. And look what Simon calls him. Master. It's not master slave. It's master. Why do teachers get, what is the secondary degree? Post-secondary education? But the master's level. That's the teaching degree. You get your baccalaureate in your introduction to a field, and then you attain the master's degree. And it is on the level of the master's degree that you become the teacher. Case in point, when you graduate from seminary, the degree you get is a Master of Divinity, or a Master of Arts and Religious Studies, or you know, whatever, MA in theology. But the MDiv is considered the gold standard in the church today. Master of Divinity. You become the teacher of the church. Now, we also, well, professors have doctorates, don't they? Yes, but the word doctor in Latin means expert. not teacher, it means expert. So that's the research level. These are the people who are the really intensive scholars. Now, in our university system, we just simply presume that people who will be the university professors are supposed to be the scholars, because that's what universities do. You do researching in universities. You're imbued with this notion of scholarship. So to have a doctorate in the whole medieval academia system meant you were expert. But master, the Latin word is magister. Look, if you would look at your degrees, if you come from one of the like Harvard or place like that where your diploma is in Latin, it will say Magister Divinitatis or something like that, or Magister Artis, Master of Arts. And that's what the word magister means. It's teacher. We say magisterial, for example. The magisterium, it's the teaching. So that's the identity that Jesus is taking on right now in this lesson. He's taking on the role of teacher. Now, in Jewish thought, that was the role of the rabbi. The rabbi is not the head of a synagogue community. In modern synagogue communities, they have a very mundane title. The head of the synagogue is the president, the presiding officer. The rabbi is the teacher. And that's why when people call Jesus rabbi, he has now sort of attained that status among the people, his own people, who were Hebrew Jewish people in Palestine in the 1st century AD. So they would be starting to call him rabbi. And we sometimes we just take that whole and entire into the scripture, but many times we translate it teacher. And when the word master is being used throughout the New Testament, particularly in the Gospels, when Jesus is addressed as master, he's being addressed as teacher. But it's not just any teacher. He's the teacher. So when Simon says, Master, we have worked all night. So it's almost like, okay, Rabbi, you know your scripture. I know fish. And we've done this, and it didn't work. And so Jesus says, well, I don't care, just, put out. And Peter says, well, all right. And so they go out and they do it. And they're rewarded for that. And the reward is this overabundance of fish. It's an interesting, when we go into the Gospel of John to a similar kind of story, and they pull in, I forgot the exact number, I'd have to look it up. It's either 163 or 167. I don't remember, but they actually say the number of fish that they counted. And the interesting thing in that context is Barclay brings this out. For example, you've heard me talk about William Barclay. He says that was the number of languages known to the people of the world at that point in time. So it's almost like the Pentecost event in Luke, where everyone hears the gospel in their own language. The fish caught by the disciples at the command of Jesus represent every language known to man at the time of Jesus in the culture that Jesus lives. So imagine that, this sort of intricate weaving of the symbolism into these rather plain narratives. And when we dive deeply into it, we begin to understand a bit more about what Jesus is doing. We begin to see what the role of these disciples is going to be. We begin to understand that, and also another bit of the symbolism is the overabundance. God, and you hear me say this around stewardship time all the time, our God is not a God of scarcity. It's not a God where we have to worry about, what the modern, acronym is FOMO, fear of missing out, because there's a limited amount of God, a limited amount of grace, a limited amount of the Holy Spirit, a limited amount of redemption. None of that is applicable when we talk about our life in God. that our life in God is one of absolute abundance to the breaking point, Luke is saying here. That the nets were so full, they were starting to break. And so they asked for help, and others come along and help them bring in the harvest. There's another part of the gospel that we know of when Jesus, when they're in a field, and you've heard this phrase, pray that the harvest master sends workers into the field, because the harvest is great and the workers are few. So that this notion of abundance coming from God is a key idea when we begin to talk about the mission and ministry of Jesus. That Jesus is no niggardly Lord. In other words, not parsimonious. He's not just giving just what you need, that there's more always, there will always be more than enough. And I've made it part of my own personal spiritual practice to recall a phrase, which I recall it in Latin because it's just easier, is Deus providebit, God will provide. And I think that's one of the things that we at St. Luke's have begun to believe a bit more. Because when I first came there, if you recall, those of you who were on the inside, the closest, the James and Johns of the old regime, that they were worried about whether they could afford a full-time priest. Look where we are now. We have a full-time priest and more. I mean, that alone is witness to the abundance of life when we do what Peter did in this gospel lection, and that is to hear the voice, and even though we're not quite sure, we step out in faith. Simon as he's called in this lesson, Simon steps out in faith. He says, all right, I don't think it's going to do anything, but I'll do it anyway. And suddenly, the abundance of God is made manifest. And there's that word again. That's why we like this for Epiphany time. The abundance of God is made manifest in this story. Any thoughts?
Well, many of us have experienced this ourselves as we grow older and we realize how much has been given to us, much of which was undeserved. And we wonder, where does it come from? Why am I so lucky? Mm-hmm. And when you start thinking about it, for me, it just goes back to, God has given me so much more than I ever expected or ever deserved. And I can't think of any other source. I'm not that smart. I'm not that great.
Well, I would beg to differ with that, but that's okay.
But yeah, I think our own life experiences duplicate this situation over and over again.
Yeah, I agree with that fully. Thank you, George. Yeah, I think, all of the, when you talk about the Horatio Alger kind of approach, the everyman person makes good, suddenly that's the fundamental attitude that people have. It's like, I came from nothing and look what I have attained. Sometimes it's the ego becomes the emphasis, but it really, what Christian faith does for us is put us in the right mindset that we didn't attain this on our own. We were instrumental, to be sure. It just didn't fall from the heavens. Yeah. But it was our willingness to step out and to say, okay, well, I'll try. Um, I remember when I was in high school, and, they give you all of the tests, everything. And I was strong in science and math. And so, what do you want to do? And want to be an engineer? Well, I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to study medicine, but then I began to look at, what it took to get into medical school. And all. I said, I don't think I can do all that. And so they were just starting the PA programs at that point. There was a school in West Virginia, I believe, which was the first one where you could go and get a bachelor's degree and end up with being qualified to be a physician's assistant. And I said, I think I can do that. And there was this sort of tyranny of low expectations, was because, neither one of my parents graduated from high school. And so I was the first in my family to graduate from high school, much less the first to be able to go to college. And so I didn't see much beyond that my horizon was rather limited. And so then I decided, people were encouraging and so on. And so I went in, I decided to shift emphasis, and I decided, well, yeah, I'll at least try. And so I went to a college that had a stellar reputation for their pre-med program. One of the reasons was they didn't guarantee that you could get into a medical school stateside, but they came pretty close to it because they were very rigorous, and they sort of discerned you out of the process if you weren't making it. They encouraged you to go into other endeavors, so that they had this wonderful record of people who would apply to medical school. Many of them would get in. And it was there that I decided I didn't want to go to medical school. And I was casting around. I didn't know where I was going to go. I was going to do. So I figured, well, I was going to be a professional anyway. So I'll do law. I'll do law. I loved history, and I loved government and all of that sort of thing. And then I had this sort of religious experience of sorts, and decided I was going to go into the ministry. And then after I was ordained a priest, and then here I am, I have, we talked about the levels of education before. I have a doctorate. I have an academic doctorate in a discipline. And when I look back at it, I go like, how did that happen? It's just, my dad would have been satisfied and very proud of me if I had gone to work at NISDOT, where he worked. The New York State Department of Transportation. Good job, good state job, good benefits, good pay, union, the whole 9 yards. He would have been delighted if that's where I went. And that would have been success in his eyes. And for a while, that's what I was thinking. But then I said, I don't want to do that work. It wasn't me. And we discovered really that our family, even though we didn't have a lot of formal education in the generations prior, we're all pretty bright people in a lot of ways. And, my dad never finished high school, but part of that was he went into the service in World War II. My mom had to leave high school at the very end of her high school career because she had to take care of her grandfather who was dying of cancer. There were all of these things. There were no such thing as a GED, and you didn't go back, that kind of stuff. You left. But she was studying at a private school in Buffalo called St. Anne's Business School. She was going to be what we would say today, an executive secretary. And she gave that up to take care of family. But then I began to realize that, the raw capacities are there. And sometimes we don't actualize them in the way that might be the best way to actually have them refined and become tremendously powerful, in the sense of, if we define power as the capacity to get something done, that, neither one of my parents had the formal education to do that. So there was a lot of raw talent, raw charism there. My brother and I received. My brother was wicked smart. He really was. He just had some other issues. So, but and here, and so I look back at my own life, just George, as you said that, and I look at that one path, that one element of it. And I go like, how did this happen? I look at that even at St. Luke's. I mean, quite frankly, I got there by mistake. And I told you the story, that I went there I came as the interim, and because I was desperate for a full-time job. The full-time position I had at St. Mark's could not be sustained. So my job was to get them ready to go part-time, and I couldn't afford to be part-time. And so I was casting around looking for a full-time position, wasn't getting anywhere, who knows why. And one thing led to another, one phone call led to another, and suddenly I was being offered one of two interim positions in the Diocese of Bethlehem, one in Scranton and one in Lebanon. Lebanon looked very attractive. It was only 25 miles from my home. I wouldn't have to be, in two different cities. Our family wouldn't have to be in two different cities. And on top of that, I worked very closely in the diocesan office with Linda Arguedas. And Linda is close friends with Beth, and Beth was the senior warden. All of you, when you look at this kind of thing, you begin to see, you can say, well, it's all just dumb luck, or you can see it's the hand of God. And that, to me, I see my role at St. Luke's as being called, literally being called to be there. Very much what's happening here. We can go back to the first lection that's assigned for this day. And what we have there, I'm going to share it with you. Is the call of the prophet Isaiah. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings, and 2 covered their faces, and with 2 covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. It's a sideline. That sound familiar? The pivots on the threshold shook at the voices of those who called, and the house was filled with smoke. Alas, I said, woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips, yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. That's a very technical term, the Lord of hosts. That means in the ancient world, that was a general's general. It was like the supreme commander. So you have, I have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. In other words, the most mighty warrior in the world. That's what the emperor in Rome would be called, for example, because he could bring down the hosts, namely the Roman legions, on a subjected power if they got a little too uppity. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. And the seraph touched my mouth with it and saying, now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out. And then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And I said, here am I, send me. And then it goes on. I think one of the interesting things about that is not only the Lord of hosts, but here is an interesting piece here. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. Now, these are spiritual beings. They don't have flesh and blood. And yet this coal was so hot. It was so hot that he had to use tongs to take it. And what did he do? He touched the lips of Isaiah with it. The preliminary preparation for Isaiah's work was essentially so painful that it was purifying. I'll just sort of leave it there. Let you think about that for a minute. Who else do we know that went through such a painful ordeal so that we know that his words are true. Careful, this one is plain as the nose on your face, which to some of us is more than others. Jesus, the crucifixion, which is again a pattern that emerges even from the prophetic era, that to speak the word of truth, one must first be purified. We just read yesterday in the Feast of the Presentation, a passage from Malachi, which we know very, it's in our brains with a melody, because it is one of the very famous passages from Handel's Messiah. And we shall be purified. There you go, Kathy. You keep saying, and he will purify, and he will purify. Then the Muslims take over and all that. The sons of Levi, more than any fuller's lie, and then John the Baptist takes that up. And what does fuller's lie do? If you put your hands in it, what happens?
It burns.
It not only burns, it eats your flesh. Not too much different than a burning coal. A burning coal, which is so hot. And so the whole notion, more than any refiner's fire. This is from Malachi. So that this reality becomes part and parcel of one's life with God. And so we then can become to look at our own call and the difficulties we go through that get us ready to let go of everything. Like Peter, or Simon, I should say, James and John, they let go of everything. But they saw an awesome thing. In their mundane lives as fishermen, they saw the most awesome thing possible. They got so many fish, they didn't know what to do with them all. Isaiah sees the Lord, the King, the Lord of hosts, the one mighty in battle, as the psalmist says. And it is another interesting little piece of that the scholars talk about. And that is this notion when at the end of that part of the passage where it says, then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? It sounds like he's talking to Isaiah, like calling Isaiah. No, he's not. He's talking to his heavenly hosts. He's having a conversation with his heavenly courtiers. Because he said, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And it's Isaiah, now that he has been cleansed and purified, who pipes up and says, here I am, send me. And the unfortunate thing about it is, I'm going to share it again and show you something. Is that right here, notice the parenthesis here, that allows us to stop there on Sunday. But if we then go through the rest of it, listen to this. Keep listening, but do not comprehend. Keep looking, but do not understand. Make the mind of this people dull and stop their ears and shut their eyes so that they may not look with their eyes or listen with their ears and comprehend with their minds and turn and be healed. Then I said, how long, O Lord? And he said, until the cities lie waste without inhabitants and the houses without people and the land is utterly desolate, until the Lord sends everyone far away and vast is the emptiness in the midst of the land. Even if a 10th part remain in it, it will be burned again. Like a terebinth or an oak whose stump remains standing when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump. Wow. That's a whole different way of seeing this. Isaiah's job is not going to be easy. He's being told, you will tell the people that they will be destroyed. And the way you will do this is by allowing them to stop up their ears and blind their eyes, to go down, in other words, to go down the road of perdition. And then the Lord of hosts will intervene and he will just wipe them away. He won't destroy them. That's the prophecy with Noah. He'll never destroy them. But he will send them away. He will send them out of Israel into captivity. That's not a happy message. And for that reason, Isaiah is not well welcomed. Where have we heard that?
Last Sunday.
We just studied that, where Jesus says this wonderful thing, but then he does the same thing. He says, I'm not working my miracles here because you want them for the wrong reasons. You want them because you want them. You want me to do things for you. You're not interested in the work of the kingdom of God. Because Jesus' message essentially is work for the kingdom and these things will follow. They wanted dessert before dinner. They wanted the outcome of the kingdom of God before doing the hard work of making the kingdom real. Because that's an inner work. That's an inner work. Life coaches, for example, will tell us in this day and age, it's fashionable in our secular world to have a life coach and a therapist and a psychologist, but they all say the same thing that spiritual masters have said through the ages. You need to do the inner work. You need to do your work before you find wholeness. You need to deal with your garbage. You need, whatever you want to say, you can say it in less polite terms too. Get your blank together kind of stuff. We know those phrases. But that's exactly what Isaiah is talking about here. And it's also what Jesus' ultimate message is. Whenever he's criticizing the scribes and the Pharisees, he's not lumping them together simply because they're scribes and Pharisees. It's because they are misunderstanding the message of the Torah. They are abusing the law of God. They're using it for their own purposes. And the bottom line is that we can never use the grace and abundance of God for our own purposes. The paradox of that is we need to let go of it all so that we get it all. But that can't be our paradigm. The transaction is not the paradigm. We simply let go. We abandon the nets. We leave behind our parents, like John and James did. They loved Zebedee. They were in league with their father as fishermen, and they just walked away. We would say, well, that's pretty crass, pretty dumb, pretty nasty for them to do. Well, doesn't Jesus say in another place, unless you lose father and mother, brothers and sisters, for the sake of the kingdom of God, you are not worthy? And the whole idea is that if all of us do that, we will all be in the kingdom together anyway. See, that is the paradox of it. Jesus says in another place, the one who holds on to his life will lose it. The one who loses his life for my sake and the sake of the kingdom of God will find it. That's the paradox of our faith. That's the paradox of Christianity. In order to live, one must die. Notice the image at the very end of the Isaiah passage. The holy seed is the stump. How many times you've cut down a tree and suddenly you've got a sapling or something coming out of the root system? That's the image we use during Advent. And a shoot shall sprout from the stump of Jesse. And we say that that's Jesus, Jesse being the father of David the king. So that, that imagery is rife all through the Old Testament and into the New. This notion of destruction before there is new life. And that is the cycle and pattern. And so it is that we go through our physical emotional, and psychological lives, and need to let all of that stuff disappear before we find our truest self, which is the spirit within. Because all of those other things are the shell in which the spirit lives. And until we can become one with that spirit, with our soul, then we're not there yet. So it is essentially a lifelong endeavor. And as the existentialist philosophers say, you are only your truest self at the moment of your death, because it is there that you are only ever truly alone.
Okay.
That's what Jean-Paul Sartre taught as an existentialist philosopher. Some people have implicated from that, well, then you should commit suicide, that life is worthless, blah, blah, blah. No, that's what he was saying at all. It's very life affirming, actually, that we need to focus on our death as not in a morbid way, but as the goal of our life. The goal of Jesus' life was his death. The outcome of his death was resurrection, a transformed new life. Soon you're thinking.
Yeah, well, I'm
I could see the wheels turning.
well, kind of creaky wheels. It's such a tall order. Wow.
Kathy, what are your thoughts?
That tall order is where I was kind of going, because I'm sitting here going, it's very hard to it's impossible to meet this commandment by myself.
Yeah.
And my human or my societal nature wants to go against it because of all the materialistic things we've been taught, and that I will admit that I enjoy.
There's nothing wrong with enjoying them.
No, but
If
you have
they've
to
been
put them in
given to us,
perspective.
it is our attitude toward them. That's the key dimension. It's our attitude. Do we grasp onto them? Go back to the Philippians hymn that we'll read on Good Friday. No, we read it on Palm Sunday, I'm sorry. Where Paul says, Jesus did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at. The Greek of that is that you just hold on to it with all your might. Not something to be held on to,
No.
Rather something to be let go.
But it's still, it's a very hard, it's a very tough thing to do.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder about my worthiness right now, and
Well,
which is a normal thing.
what did Simon say here?
Yeah, I
Go away from me, master. I am a
I'm
man
not
of
worthy.
unclean. Yeah, I'm not worthy. And Isaiah says, I am a man of unclean lips. And that's why God sends the coal to burn his lips, because that's what Isaiah
Yeah.
picked out as his
fault.
his need to be purified. So in essence, if we want to, draw some spiritual truth from this journey that we're talking about, it is a journey, and it is lifelong. And we never attain it until that moment when we transition from this life to the next. The preface text in the Mass for the Dead in our prayer book says, Lord, for your faithful people, life is changed, not ended. And so what we see as death is this sort of not this portal to get into heaven. That's not what we're, I mean, that's a bit too materialistic, but rather it's this process of being transformed. And it's the moment where that becomes full fruit, where the tree blossoms, if you will, or the seed sprouts, or, you know, whatever it is, what other metaphor you want to use. But our life then is this lifelong challenge to move away from the grasping that our physical nature demands. See, you know, we have this deep inner drive to survive. And so that is what moves us to grasp life. It's not to say that we should be willy-nilly about it, because the life itself is also a gift from God. But it is not the whole of who we are. Our truest self is our soul. Our truest self as an identity in terms of the spark of life that comes from God is the soul. We go back to Genesis. You know, on Ash Wednesday, what do we say? We mark the ashes and we go, remember you are dust and into dust you shall return. Remembering the words of God to Adam in the book of Genesis. And the fact that, yes, we were dust, but what happened? God breathed life into the nostrils of the man which he has made, as the verse says. And it is that life then that is our truest self, because that is where we are in the image and likeness of God. Everything else is a covering, a shell, as it were. I don't mean in the sense that, you know, we're not this sort of very Gnostic, and it's a heresy within Christianity to think this way, that, you know, our souls are trapped inside our bodies. No, this is part of who we are, but our truest self, in the sense of our identity, is not our body. It's not our bodily means. It is deep within us. It is part of who we are. And what happens is that is the seed that eventually sprouts when we shed the shell. You know, the shell of a seed is not separate from the life of the seed. It just is changed and transformed under the right circumstances. It falls away.
How did you ever get to be so wise?
I'm not wise. This is the word of God.
Yeah.
It's also 40 years of thinking about it.
Yeah.
I'd like to get back a little bit
Sure.
to when you were talking about Rabbi being a teacher.
Mhm.
And our image of a teacher is one learned person talking to people who wish to learn. But there are different levels of that. And when I was thinking about what I wanted to do for a career, I wondered why it was that certain programs of residency training turned out one chairman of a department after another,
Mhm.
and other programs, similar medical schools of good reputation, turned out nobody who went into into academic medicine. And as I looked at it, I discovered the one difference between those were when the program had all full-time faculty. Those programs turned out one leader after another. And the other programs, like the one I was in, where it was all part-time faculty, they didn't. And the reason I came to was with the full-time faculty, they were with us all the time,
Right.
day in, day out, night and day. And they were more than teachers. They became mentors, and they changed people's lives
Yeah.
rather than just teaching them the technical aspect or of a disease or of an operation. And I look at Jesus, and when he's talking to his apostles, he is their mentor.
Mhm,
He is changing their lives.
mhm.
When he's sitting in the boat lecturing to a crowd of people out there, he's teaching.
Right,
He's
right.
making them think about the world and their part in it. But he isn't necessarily mentoring to them, but to his apostles, he does it day in and day out until they are changed.
Absolutely. Perfect. Perfect pitch on that, George, because that is the model of how we do discipleship in the church.
Yes.
We do discipleship by walking with one another, by being together in community. Kathy, you said earlier that you cannot do this on your own. You can't envision you doing it, and you are spot on with that. It is not possible to do it alone, because what it leads to is what some would say that Sartre was trying to say, that this becomes an impossible task. And so through life, so what I have to do is hasten my death. And so you get the whole existentialist suicide thing, that some philosophers got into in modern philosophy. But what is life affirming about seeing death as the goal of our life is that to take it down a notch, to put it like in kids' terms, you tell them they want to get to heaven. You teach them, what is one of those catechism answers that we learned as kids? Is, why did God make me? God made me to know him, to love him, to serve him in this world, and to be happy with him forever in the next. That was sort of the rote answer that we learned as children, because that's how children speak and that's how children think. But as adults, it isn't and unfortunately we stay on that level in our faith too often. And that it is about building the community in which we nurture and mentor each other on this journey. That is the essential element of church. Not to be, I don't mean this as a criticism, because it's simply a different model of church. But when we look at the megachurch model, where you have the chief pastor, like the LCBC kind of thing, everybody, in our area is always talking about them. They have the teaching pastor, and he gets up and he speaks on Sunday, and they have all these satellite communities, and they're listening to him on a big screen. That's Jesus in the boat. They accomplish, the ones that are successful, like Saddleback and a number of others, the ones that do that successfully, then what they do in their ministry is that they create small groups. And in the small groups, that therein you have disciplers, they call them. And it is in the small groups then that people learn the way. Look at, and again, I'm trying to teach a little bit by the way I do things. Look at the way I sign my pastorals or sign my articles in the newsletter, which you will get. With you as a companion along the way. I see my role as a teacher, very much, George, as you described it, not only as someone who can impart information. I can do that in a classroom very effectively. Kathy's been in my class. But this kind of conversation as we're having today, and to be able to know people well enough to say the things that resonate in their hearts and their minds, that's where the mentoring begins. And the showing, the demonstration of living it out. And that's when we do it one to another. And so that the ministry of disciple making is not only of the rabbi, of the teacher, it is of the entire community. So let's go back to the rabbinic model, for example. Hillel, for example, was one of the ancient. You will hear Talmudic scholars talk about the school of Hillel, because you see, he gathered together for himself disciples, and he taught them, and they became and he lived with them, and because you won't go to yeshiva. I mean, you are in the midst and constantly eating and talking and arguing all the time. Well, that is the same thing that Jesus did, and it is what Jesus calls us to do. So that it is the community's task to make disciples. In the ancient church, for example, to get into the church, you became a catechumen. You were a catechumen for 3 years, and you lived and ate and breathed and did all that along with other Christians until you were scrutinized. We go through the scrutinies and the last Lent of their pattern. And before they were baptized, they were scrutinized by the community, and the community approved or disapproved of them. And then they became members of the community when they were baptized. So that it's clearly an effort of the community. We're trying to toy with that a little bit. I just can get very practical for a moment. When the Lenten information comes out, you can see it on the Christian Formation website already. It's there under the adults. Our theme is walk with purpose. And the idea, again, is this sort of peripatetic thing of, constantly on a journey. But Mother Mary is asking people to sign up for a sort of a prayer marathon of sorts, that for 30 days you will sign up, and you will get emails from her specifically about praying for the people who will be confirmed when the bishop comes the Sunday after Easter. In other words, the community being part of the support system for the people who are joining the church. So that is part of what we do. So it's, and in fact, we even try to get mentors in the program. For example, we've got, the Gilbert kids are in the program. And so we've engaged the Hackett's to be their mentors, so that, they are always there. They're another set of adults that they can go and talk to. We have a few others. Matt Haig is one of them, for example, that's available. He's in the program that, that the people who are in the program see others there with them along the way. They're not probably learning all that much new that they didn't already know, because it's pretty basic, church stuff, but they're there to support, maybe to advise or commiserate with, or whatever, if you feel comfortable doing that. But it's a symbol of the community support. So to this prayer that we're going to undertake, it begins, I think, on the 25th of March and goes to the Easter Sunday. That's the 30 days. So that we would pray every day for these folk. So yeah, I think you're both spot on with that. This journey that we're trying to talk about, this abandonment, this humiliation, as it were, being made humble, is not a negative thing. It is a change in perspective. Is it a transformation of heart? It's a lifelong process, and it is a communal process. So none of us is ever alone in this journey.
Good.
Put the capstone on it. Okay, it's time for us to end anyway. So
That is very important for me to hear right now, because I'm
Okay,
not sure where my journey is. I can admit to you guys, I do not know where my journey is going right now.
well, that is the idea of the journey. But it's, think of Simon. When you're hearing the lessons this weekend, Kathy, think of Simon. We've been at it this whole time.
Yeah.
I don't know what you want me to do. All right, I'll do it. And yet he just goes and does it, and
Yeah.
look what happens.
Well,
You
right
just-
now I'm enjoying the journey as much as I do not like to write papers, and
Well, but it's a journey you chose right now.
that is true. I have chosen it freely, and
And hopefully you chose it because you felt called to do it.
yeah, I did feel called to do it, and I'm enjoying it. I'm just a little nervous about it, can I
Well,
say?
that's fine. There's nothing
Yeah,
wrong with
you
that.
know? Yeah.
And my homiletics class, I keep reminding people because they say, well, they're doing their first sermons in their parishes and so on. And they're always worried, they got butterflies, they get anxious and all this stuff. I said, I've been doing this off and on 40 years. I took 6 years off as a full-time minister, but I've been doing it a good long time. I still get that way on Sunday. And some might see that I can be a little grumpy before Mass on Sunday, particularly if they're like trying to distract me with things, because I need to focus. And so when somebody comes up to me and they start talking business 5 minutes before church, I kind of say, I don't want to talk about that now, and so some people think I'm being curt or short, but the reality is I got to get my head together.
That's why we wait till afterwards to talk business.
That's the way it should be. Yeah. So coffee hours are for if we ever get back to that.
Yeah.
But the numbers are getting better, so we might end up actually. I'm very happy about that. The new cases have dropped precipitously in Lebanon County, which I'm very grateful for. Actually, faster than Lancaster and a couple of others around, which is unusual. But I'm still watching the really important ones, which is hospitalizations and deaths. And when they start to trend down on a permanent way, then we can start to sort of reopen some things. But for now, we're sort of coasting along. All right, folks. See you next week. Take care.
Good.
Yes, take care. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.